It is commonly acknowledged that the very first official bullet hell game is Batsugun by Toaplan, and while I do not think this is an inaccurate statement, I do think it is incomplete, because what's important to understand about shmups is that they're a very iterative genre. Ideas and concepts build up over time across multiple developers, all of whom are commingling and creating rivalries and reacting to each other's design. It's a much more immediate development process that we have these days, where a game comes out 6 years ago, and so developers like, oh yeah, let's get into that style of game design, and then many years later they come out with their game and it just is not in the times anymore because of how long it takes to develop a game now. It doesn't have that same immediate reactivity as the arcade genres, and especially something like shmups, where a shmup could be made and released in like 8 months sometimes. It's crazy the turnaround on these games because of that legacy skill among not only the players but also among the developers. They already kind of know what they're doing and are able to work in a much more immediate environment. And that's very important to understand when it comes to the evolution and development of something like bullet hell, because it's not like modern genres now where one game appears out of nowhere and everyone reacts to it. Instead, it's much more iterative, it's much more gradual. And so when you try to sit down and identify where does bullet hell officially begin, it's kind of like sitting down with those color sliders in paint and identifying when does it become blue? Where is the official transition point from being green to being blue? It happens somewhere, but where exactly that is kind of up to you to some degree, because you can individually determine at what state does that threshold become blue. That is not an exact science, and you can kind of sit down and try to get a consensus on this. And I think that's what happened with Batsugun, where by most players' metrics, if you sit them all down, Batsugun has enough of the ingredients to say, okay, it is officially bullet hell now. But I want to paint a bigger picture here, because I think there are more things going into bullet hell that predate Batsugun, even immediately, and then some things afterward, post Batsugun, that I think are very key developments in the bullet hell subgenre. And so in my opinion, when it comes to the birth of bullet hell, there are 3 key games you need to look at: Grindstormer, Batsugun, and then DonPachi afterward. All of them contribute something I think very significant towards the identity of the bullet hell genre. So let's begin by talking about Grindstormer real quick. It's called V5 in Japan, but that's a terrible title these days in terms of algorithms and searchability. And also, I think the Grindstormer version is more bullet hell than the V5 version because of the screen clearing bomb. But the key thing that happened with Grindstormer is very interesting, which is Akeda appears. So this is Akeda's first game that he ever worked on, and that's very significant because he'd become the man to then sort of develop the modern bullet hell style that we know today with Cave, of course. And through a funny quirk of fate, what ended up happening during the development of that game is they were given sort of pre-programmed tools by Toaplan to create Grindstormer. And so Akeda and his team were creating the game, but in the pre-programmed tools, the guy who sent it to them, I guess mistakenly, made the hitbox smaller than it should have been. So they went ahead and started programming the game with this smaller hitbox, not realizing it at first, and saying, wow, this game feels really good. The dodging in this game feels fantastic. The programmer said to them, well, that's because the hitbox is smaller than it's supposed to be. And so it began with sort of an accident, but I think it's very important to understand as video game critics and players that there's a huge difference between something occurring early on in a game's development accidentally and something occurring in the game that the developers were never aware of and just exists without their knowledge. Because at some point, Akeda and the team working on Grindstormer did realize, oh, this hitbox was smaller than it normally supposed to be. And so that accident then became intention. So you cannot say bullet hells are an accident or small hitboxes are an accident, because during the creation process, this was recognized, and then the value of this was recognized by the developers, and they decided, all right, let's make this actually officially part of the game. They formally acknowledged the hitbox is small, and so that then changed the whole trajectory of the games that would follow afterwards. So that's the key thing about Grindstormer. The key number one thing is that small hitbox. Batsugun did not innovate this. Grindstormer, right before it did. Batsugun followed afterwards, so then the Akeda team followed up on the ideas of Grindstormer in Batsugun, and now that they are more experienced with working with this smaller hitbox, then we start to see the more characteristic, dense, slightly slower moving bullet patterns that make bullet hell what they are, especially in the unreleased special version of Batsugun, which was shown and developed in 1994 but never came out until I think the Saturn version had a version of it, and the prototypes, obviously you can get the ROM online, but the special version was never officially released in arcades during that era. But if you follow along with special version, it's like the missing link between Batsugun Arcade and DonPachi, because it's ramping up the density of the bullets even more. In the later loops, it's starting to slow them down in these big waves and stuff. And so bullets are not just this temporary fast-moving hitbox that you have to avoid. Those still exist, but then supplementing those, you now have these slow-moving, active terrain-style bullet patterns. That's why bullet hell doesn't have terrain in the same way that Gradius and R-Type do, where the developers in the classic era, they needed ways to funnel the play field and create paths, and so they used terrain and walls and things like that to do that, which is cool. But in the bullet hell era, the terrain and walls become actual bullet patterns that are dynamic, and sometimes they're completely static, but a lot of times they're aimed or based off of the player's position. And so this development in bullet hell of creating paths through the levels via the enemy design and via the way the enemies shoot their projectiles is certainly the defining feature of bullet hell, much more so than the actual bullet count itself. It really doesn't matter so much how many bullets are on screen. That's just a byproduct of this style of design. But there is no reason why you couldn't create a bullet hell these days and get the same dynamics and just use giant bullets instead of using, small clusters of them. You could still get really similar dynamics, giant bullet patterns slowly moving through the screen, creating dynamic terrain that reacts to the player's position. That is the defining feature of bullet hell, and we see it really clearly in Batsugun, especially the special edition. And so it certainly makes sense to classify Batsugun as the official first bullet hell on these grounds. But for me, this is not where the story ends, because we're still missing one very fundamental key ingredient to what makes bullet hells what they are. And that key ingredient appears in DonPachi by Cave. The ingredient I'm referring to is the concentrated fire mechanic, where if you hold down shot, you get this concentrated laser that comes out that slows down your ship speed. Slowing down is very important. Or if you tap the shot button or just use the C auto fire button, then you get the spread shot and you get that at full speed. This modulation of speed, though, is what is critical. It is such a revolutionary mechanic that it not only affected bullet hell design moving forward, but all modern shmup design since that point. These days, if you're making a shmup, even if it's not a bullet hell, whether or not you include this mechanic of concentrated fire is going to define the feel of your game, bullet count withstanding. It doesn't matter if your game has a ton of bullets or not. If you decide to put in a concentrated fire mechanic, it's going to suddenly feel like a more modern shmup. Or the other way around, if you decide, no, there is not going to be a concentrated fire mechanic, then your shmup is instantly going to feel more classic, because up until that point, the mechanic wasn't really established in the same way that it was in DonPachi. And yes, of course, like I was saying before, shmups are a very iterative genre. There's a lot of gradient. There's a lot of diversity across the games in terms of mechanics. And so is DonPachi exactly the very first shmup to use a concentrated fire mechanic in the way that it does? I honestly don't know. It's completely possible that there's some old shmup hanging around out there somewhere that also has a concentrated fire mechanic like this that predates DonPachi. But the key thing to recognize is that it occurred in DonPachi in this bullet hell framework, because you put those two together and that's where you get the real magic, because it allowed for a lot more complex and dynamic bullet patterns from that point forward, where they could create patterns that not only ask you to dodge in these very microscopic, tiny little spacings, because now you have the slow speed to do that, but then they could suddenly shift the pattern to, okay, now you need to fly full speed, mid-pattern, mid-movement. The ability to change your speed that quickly and that naturally is really important, because yes, before the concentrated fire mechanic, you had like speed shifts and you had gears and you had all kinds of ways to change the speed of your ship, but a lot of them were much more preemptive and routing based, where you came into a section and you knew, okay, this section I want to be on high speed, this section I want to be on low speed, or maybe there were delays in between patterns where you're able to shift the speed. It was more something you did in anticipation of what was going to happen. But with bullet hell, and with especially how bullet hell would develop later on as this mechanic got even more refined, you were asked to change your speed mid-dodge and mid-pattern all of the time. Think of something like the hibachi fight that appears in DonPachi later on without the concentrated fire mechanic. Would it be possible? Yes, it would be possible, but you would not be able to reliably engage with that level of pattern complexity if you did not have this mechanic. And you can see as bullet hell goes onward and Cave continues to make games, how much they develop and push this concept. And it's actually pretty crazy that it's not recognized that DonPachi is where this first appeared. As much as I love DonPachi, poor DonPachi lives in its shadow in a lot of unfortunate ways, because not only did it introduce the concentrated fire mechanic, it also introduced the TLB, the true last boss. Hibachi, the ultimate TLB, in my opinion, that appears in DonPachi, but DonPachi did introduce the concept of the TLB to the shmup playing world. Again, there might be some older shmup hanging out there that has a TLB before DonPachi, but in terms of the progression of this bullet hell design, it is DonPachi that brings the TLB to bullet hell in the form of Big B, as I like to call it, or
Taisabachi,
the official Japanese name. So let's talk about the history of DonPachi a little bit. Like I said in the beginning, the roots of Cave start at Toaplan, and they start during Grindstormer. Then after Grindstormer, Akeda and friends worked on Batsugun, and then after they released Batsugun, Toaplan nosedived, and that was the end of the great mother of shmups. Toaplan's gone. But there's all this talent. There's all these developers, and like I said before, this was a very active, robust time in the arcade world. So they're not just going to go home and they're going to continue to try to do what they've trained and what their passion is. And so all these other sort of branches come out of Toaplan, and the one we're focusing on today is Akeda's branch, Cave. So he begins working on DonPachi, and everyone is looking at Cave at this time and saying, all right, this is the successor to Toaplan. So all the Toaplan fans, from what I understand, this is all, secondhand information from research, but all the Toaplan fans are sitting there waiting like, all right, where's Tiger Heli? Where's our Toaplan games? And out comes DonPachi, which is a very natural follow-up to what they're working on with Batsugun, and especially Batsugun Special Edition, but people didn't play Batsugun Special Edition, so they were not quite ready for what Cave were putting out, at least the people writing reviews. Because it seems like the arcade players, people who were playing Psycho and Toaplan at the time, they seem to connect with DonPachi. And the one positive review I could find of DonPachi at the time was from a guy that compared the game to Gunbird, so he was a little bit more tuned in with the burgeoning bullet hell style, where the Toaplan players and the people expecting the next Toaplan game, they weren't super thrilled. And so it seemed like DonPachi actually came out with a pretty negative to mixed reception from critics and from people at that time. And then many years later, Ikeda reflects back on the DonPachi era and says that he essentially felt like he was living in Toaplan's shadow, and DonPachi was underneath Toaplan's shadow. And so Cave wasn't taken on its own merits and on its own style until, of course,
DonPachi.
But I do not want to do DonPachi a disservice, because it seems like not just in the heart of the Electric Underground, but in the heart of the entire shmup playing world, poor DonPachi has been kind of overlooked. It's a really overlooked, underappreciated game, especially because of how many innovations it laid forward. But I think because it was in that transitionary era between Toaplan and DonPachi, and people didn't know what to expect, they weren't really on the lookout for innovation necessarily. And so now it kind of lives in this purgatory of Toaplan fans are much more interested in Batsugun and the end of Toaplan. Cave fans are much more interested in the great surge of DonPachi and afterward. And poor DonPachi is left neglected in the corner. Even ironically, in this video series, Legacy of Cave, I imagine that DonPachi will not get as much attention as its later Cave brethren. So there's that irony there that I am quite aware of, but it's kind of interesting. So let's talk about DonPachi now. We've set the scene. I've established why this is an important game. Now let's get into what this game feels like, how it plays, and why I definitely recommend, if you haven't played it before and you want to start your journey into bullet hell, DonPachi is a cool starting point. I think the best way to characterize the gameplay of DonPachi as compared to its later bullet hell brethren is as brutally honest and straightforward. It is a lot more clear and easy to understand what is happening in this game than you get later on in the more maximum bullet hell style of stuff like DFK and SDOJ and even Futari. That is why I think this is a great starting point, where if you're entering into bullet hell, you know exactly what is happening. And one big reason for that is the way the enemies are segmented and laid out. It is much more akin to the Toaplan style, but I think a nice intermediary between the two, where it isn't as absurd as some of the Toaplan games get, like Truxton 2, but it isn't as messy and organic as we see even in the sequel of DonPachi, where if you look to the way the enemies appear on screen in DonPachi, they come in these nice organized groups, and these groups and waves and spawns don't overlap with each other nearly as much as in DonPachi. I do like ultimately the more organic linking style of DonPachi, but what makes it interesting in DonPachi is the way it plays back with the chaining system of the game, because a good comparison is if you look at Devil Blade Reboot, a recent, more beginner-friendly shmup, it also has this very same segmented style as DonPachi. They have quite of an overlap between there, but the thing that differentiates them at high-level play, and that I think makes DonPachi a much deeper game ultimately, is that the meta of Devil Blade Reboot is all about point blanking, which naturally fits really well in with the segmented, organized style of enemies coming in discrete waves and discrete patterns. But ironically, because it fits so well naturally with that style of play, the layer of depth kind of bottoms out really early, because it turns out in order to survive, you want to point blank things, and in order to score, you want to point blank things. So it just becomes a matter of routing that really precisely and pulling that off. What makes DonPachi very interesting is there's a real natural tension between what the game wants you to do to survive, which is to kill things right as they appear on screen, and what the game wants you to do in terms of scoring with its really strict chaining system, which makes you leave things on screen for a very long time in order to get these links. And it is my suspicion that some of this is intended, but also some of it is not quite intended. because I do not think DonPachi was built around the chaining system like DonPachi is. It's clear DonPachi, for many reasons, like the actual on-screen meter and the way the enemies lay out and the way that you're able to full chain most stages, it's clear that in DonPachi, chaining is the central concept of that game's level design. In DonPachi, I don't think this is exactly the case for two reasons. The first is that the chaining system, just in terms of user interface, seems very thrown in at the end. There isn't that on-screen chain meter indicator like we get in DonPachi, and the system doesn't even tell you if you're chaining until you're quite a bit into the chain. So when you're first starting your chain, especially when you're first learning the routing of the game, you're not quite sure, wait, is this chaining, is this linking? So there's a lot of mystery in terms of how the chaining system works, how long the cooldown timer is and stuff. You have to really investigate that through just pure gameplay. But then on top of that, the segmented style of the enemy design, it's very clear that this extremely strict chain timer plus these very discrete segmented waves of enemies, these two are not meant to coincide with one another. But I think what ended up happening is the game seems much more interested in the get point system in terms of scoring, because that's much more clearly communicated to the player. There's a lot clearer indication of what's happening there in the user interface than what is happening with the chaining system. And so what I think happened, this is just a theory, but I think what happened is they started with the get point system and then decided, oh, well, it'd be cool if we added in this chaining dynamic and added that in later on. Then, of course, that chaining dynamic was much more interesting than the get point system, so then that becomes the basis of DonPachi. And so what we have in DonPachi is pretty interesting because there is this real strong tension between the way the enemies are laid out and the way the chaining system is so strict that makes a lot of room in terms of the player in routing and in creativity, because you're playing against this very natural conflict of how the enemies are laid out versus how the scoring system works. And so it ironically creates a lot of depth in terms of routing, in terms of analyzing the game, because the chaining is so strict and because these links are so tight, and the fact that you can't fully link together all of the chains through all of the levels creates this short form of momentum, very much like Ketsui, where if you make a mistake in this one chain, all right, try to do better next time, but you continue on through the run. It gives the game a more holistic run feel, versus with DonPachi, because of the fact that you can full chain the stages. That means if you drop the chain, all right, time to reset. So ironically, because the chains of DonPachi are shorter and tighter and more strict, that ironically makes it less of a marathon and reset heavy than DonPachi. And I'll be honest, I am a big fan of DonPachi's marathon, giant, unwavering brutality of its scoring system. But I can also see that a lot of players, especially if you're into games like Ketsui, much more preferring this style of scoring system where you can improve more holistically, can break up the game to little sections, and then you add in the suicide bullet dynamics and the no-miss dynamics. And so if you're a fan of DonPachi, if you're a fan of Ketsui, and you kind of want something a little bit in between, DonPachi is an interesting game to look at, but with a more chill difficulty in terms of pure survival than Ketsui. So DonPachi, I think, has been overlooked for a very long time because I don't think its strengths are entirely recognized. And another thing about DonPachi that's really cool is maybe if you're not a huge fan of the maximum bullet hell style that Cave develops later on, DonPachi still has some elements that still feel reminiscent of the classic shmup era. For example, the boss fights of DonPachi stand out a lot more from the rest of the Cave games later on because they have a much more classic feel in the fact that the bosses usually have unique bullets, unique attacks. Some of them are even like unique behaviors that feel right out of Taito, like in stage 3, the way the bullets will like change, shift around and stuff. And then later on, too, you get unique bullet patterns that the bosses have that is a bit different than what Cave ultimately ends up doing, because if you look later on in the Cave games, the boss fights, they tend to have some unique bullets and stuff, but the Cave bosses begin to use more of the standard bullets and emphasize patterns, where in DonPachi, you still have that classic boss fight design of, hey, the boss has unique attacks, unique bullets. And another thing that DonPachi does with its enemy design that stands out is how much it spawns them from the bottom and from the sides, and how much the game pushes the player to use the aura of the ship, especially if you're playing Type A. There become sections later on where the aura is kind of mandatory, and I think the reason for the creation of the aura was dealing with this style of enemy design and level layout, where if you're shooting with a concentrated fire in front of you, or you're shooting with a narrow shot in front of you, how are you supposed to address these things coming from behind and coming from the sides? Well, you have this protective aura when you're in laser. That's really emphasized in this game, and that builds up a lot more because it becomes an even stronger point-blanking mechanic that you use a lot in
DonPachi.
And so you can see that there are a lot of elements that ultimately become characteristic of Cave, like the point-blanking aura, that probably would not have happened without DonPachi's more unique style of design. And that is the really cool thing about DonPachi, and why I think a lot of people should be taking a look at it, because it's kind of a tipping point for a lot of people interested in bullet hell, where if you're in the Psycho side, you're going to enjoy, like I said, the guy who liked Gunbird, he liked DonPachi. That didn't surprise me. Then if you're like Ketsui, you're going to like DonPachi. And then, of course, if you like DonPachi, you're going to enjoy DonPachi because it has the beginnings and the framework for what would become later on. So it's actually this great sort of merging of all these different styles and all these different ideas. Even though it is the first Cave shmup, it's got a lot going on, and I think it needs to be taken a lot more seriously than it has been. And I can understand that because it has lived in the shadow of DonPachi for so long. But it's absolutely worth your time. It's got a great graphical style. It kind of reminds me, almost chibi a little bit, how cute and compact all of the enemy design is. And then you throw in Bob, the announcer. It has this kind of playful, fun, goofy feel to it that is also really distinct from the rest of the Cave games as they go on, especially you get into the more serious, moody, dark stuff of DOJ and Ketsui. As much as I like that, that's my thing, but I can see if you want a more like cartoony, fun, almost Raizing or Taito kind of feel, DonPachi is worth looking at. Absolutely. And so a quick word on the console ports of DonPachi, both the Saturn and PlayStation 1. Neither of them are really all that accurate, because remember, it's important to understand that during this era of console ports and of arcade games, DonPachi was made using a lot of hardware-based slowdown and a lot of hardware-based balance. And so recreating that and capturing that accurately by trying to reprogram it back onto a PlayStation or onto a Sega Saturn, it's not going to be super accurate. Like, the basic structure is there, the basic idea is there, but if you want to play the game definitively, accurately, and in a way that lines up with the scoring of the arcade version, you're gonna have to emulate this game. Think of the console versions as like different arranges of DonPachi, like their own little versions of the game, but they're not accurate enough or faithful enough to the arcade to really be a viable replacement. Same thing with DonPachi, of course. Just this era of console ports is not that strong, to be honest. And so that is it for the first episode of Legacy of Cave, the monthly video series where I go through all the Cave games one by one until the end. And so next month is going to be my favorite game of all time, DonPachi. So I'm very excited for that. And if you enjoyed this video, please check out a previous video I recently uploaded called Why Permadeath Matters, because that is going to talk a lot about why classic games are the way they are and what makes arcade games feel so distinctive from modern games, and a lot of that goes back to their permadeath structure. So that is a video that I think is a little bit overlooked as it is right now, very much like DonPachi. So please check that out if you can. And also, I am a full-time YouTuber now, which is what makes Legacy of Cave possible in the first place. So if you can, please support me on Patreon. That's the #1 way I'm able to continue doing what I do and allow me to continue moving forward. And I'd really appreciate any Patreon support if you can. And so thanks so much. Please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Ali Hashmi, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Ally, Autonamed, B-Lit, Beam Pit, Bo, Ben Foster, Beto Dames, Blade Symphony, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borky22, Chad Memphis, Chase Palumbo, Jay Phillip, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Choreo, Crump 12, Des Audio, DRK, Dances Within Cells, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Aldris, David Crespo, Did I Done, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dingo, Dio, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Eduardo, Edvard, EJ, Elvin Senisev, Eleanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Evie Zerker, Falkis, F Deluxe, Fenich, Fiskin, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, Hausu, Hero Death, Ikihime, Hanharthi, HUD, Hugh Mungus, Jdab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Ken 10082, Kiss Kissian, Contain, Praise the Boys, Langoblian, Ludwa, Walberta, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Mecha Roca, Minung, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, New Jam, Michael Polito, Michael McCord, My Liddy, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Morag, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Beyond Dagger Games, Nervous J, Oglakugels, Patrick Basteman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Isilis, Vilaz, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, Cycle Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Quinlan Yeager, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Raul, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Ricky, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Salmon Connections, Senevo, Scanline City, Segfault, Shantak, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Zeropong, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steven Bridges, Stepplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Kamzarian, FaZe Ryu, The Brute Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, Yoel Bensta, Tim French, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Tsugumo, 2IU, Twes Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Rena, Wabby Legs, What Is This? Your Nerdy Joe, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zeno, Zen Ryoku.